Roughly 35 years ago, George R.R. Martin was growing frustrated, butting heads with TV executives about his TV pilots and screenplays not being made, the most common issues being budgeting and episode lengths, which pushed him back into writing books. He began with a novel that, for the time and even arguably today, would be impossible to adapt. 5 years later, Game of Thrones would be published, and it would take the world by storm, or at least the fantasy world. Yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine considering the impact the series has now, but when it first came out, it was only really known in groups who went out of their way to enjoy fantasy. In total, by 2011, just before the show came out, the franchise, which had 4 books out, had sold 12 million copies, which means if you want to be generous, I think you can allocate 3 to 5 million of those sales to specifically Game of Thrones, which compared to the likes of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit with 100 million copies sold, and J.K. Rowling's Philosopher's Stone matching those numbers. I don't say this to discredit or belittle George. Unlike those two titans of fantasy, there are many reasons why Game of Thrones didn't sell as well. It was much more mature and violent, with that alone removes families that would buy the books for the kids. And let's face it, back then there was not nearly as many grown adults interested in the genre as today. I'd like to think I would have bought it, but I wasn't even born at the time, and wouldn't be for another year after Game of Thrones was published. Regardless though, Game of Thrones was a success, which resulted in him writing and publishing 3 more books over the next 9 years, which I have to say is a pretty damn reasonable speed at writing these books, though A Feast for Crows took up more than half of that time, and after that it took another 6 years for A Dance with Dragons. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about though. And who would be worried, cause not only was A Dance with Dragons released, but so was the first episode of the TV show of the series, and me, a spry young freshman in high school, had no idea about the series. Come on, I was 14 years old. It would have been irresponsible of my parents to let me read or watch this show, and for the most part, I was ignorant of the series. It wasn't until I was 17 years old that a smelly Irishman, who was a friend of the family, recommended it and gave us the first season to try out. Now, it was mature, and my parents both said I was not allowed to watch it without them, and I was a good boy and listened to them. The next day, I was relaxing in the living room with my mom, and we watched the first episode of Game of Thrones. Or, actually, we watched half of it, cause when we made it to the part where Tyrion was having sex with some whores, she snatched the remote and got out of that episode really quickly, much to my annoyance because I was really enjoying the visuals. Which I want to just point out, Mom, when you're watching this, pretty hypocritical, because you had no issues with me watching Outlander, which was, if anything, just as titillating, though admittedly no dwarf sex. Maybe that's why she wasn't a fan. Can't believe my mom would be so bigoted. Well, my mother didn't have the stomach for it, so I had to go with my dad, who, give some credit, actually made it through the first episode, though it clearly wasn't his cup of tea, as when Bran was pushed out the window, he asked, "Why'd he do that?" Now, had I told him the queen was cheating on her husband with that man, maybe he would have given me his stamp of approval and let me to continue the series without supervision. But nope, my dumbass said, "Oh, the queen was cheating on her husband
with her brother."
He put a stop to that real fast, and I was not allowed to watch it. I pointed out that I was literally about to be a legal adult in a handful of months, but that didn't matter to him. It was his house, his rules, and he was not going to have any incest shows in this house. To which I said fine, and I moved out the house. That's right, you could say that Game of Thrones is the reason I moved out of my parents' house. If you ignore the fact that I'd already been making plans to move out when I turned 17, but if we stick to the original, it's far more entertaining and crazy. The first day I moved out of my house, I finished unpacking, I plugged in my PC, and binge-watched the entire first season of Game of Thrones, and I was hooked. Season 2 and 3 were knocked out in the following days, and 4 the very next one. I loved it. The harsh, gritty medieval setting with the adult bite to it, the fact that I honestly didn't know who would live and who would die. Well, except Sean Bean. Dude was famous for dying in movies, and the series was famous for killing off important characters. I still got a bit sad at his death, but boy, when I got hit by the Red Wedding, I fucking pog-champed. Hell, Season 5 had already started airing with 2 episodes out, so I got through those quickly and started watching week by week, which I fucking hated. In my older years, I've begun to understand the practical and even beneficial reasons to a weekly release schedule, but at the time, I didn't care for it. I wanted all that shit right now. I was high off Game of Thrones at this point. I was snorting shade of the evening that was soaked in basilisk blood. It didn't matter at all that Season 5 was kind of lackluster. It still had me gripped by the balls. And when they killed Jon Snow, I lost my mind. They killed Jon Snow? How could they kill Jon Snow? He's like Dany and Tyrion, the protag of the series. But now, I was out of episodes to watch. What could I do? Well, a memory came flooding back to me as my mother and I were leaving the movie theater after watching The Lightning Thief. I pulled her arm, looked her in the eyes, and asked, "Mom, why was the movie so ass, but the books are so good?" She looked over at me, smiled, lifted up her purse, and started to beat me for swearing like that. But as she was beating me, she told me, "The books are always better than the movie." So why couldn't it be true with the show? And y'all, it was. I went out, got Game of Thrones from my local library, and I read that book in a month, which for my dyslexic ass is very fast. I do want to say though, I honestly think that had I read the book before the show, I would have dropped it. I didn't like reading, and for my dumb teenager brain, I think a lot of the good stuff would have gone over my head. And all the names would have been confusing, but since I had the show to add the visual aspect, I was able to digest the book much easier. So hey, if by some random chance you tried to read the book but couldn't get into it, watch the first season of the show and see if that helps. Though nobody's going to take this advice because I can count on one stump the amount of people here who watch my channel and haven't at least watched the show, except my mom. But she plays my videos in the background, so that hardly counts. Love you, Mom. I still have that fracture you gave me with that purse. After reading the books, though, I really got into it from there, diving into the web to join the fandoms and discussions. Learned some crazy stuff like R plus L equals J, which I loved. I also came across Tyrion Targaryen, which is ass, and also incredibly disturbed by the amount of incest shipping. Why do so many of you think Arya x Jon is hot? I don't care that they are cousins. That was not confirmed at the time, and even if it was, it's still gross. Also looked into some of the fanfiction writings, and it's just as bad. Most of them introduce a brand new character who's the protagonist of either being the twin sister of Jon Snow or the twin brother of Daenerys, and they often end up fucking their sibling. Ew! You guys are not beating the allegations. Look, I've done a little bit of creative writing. No plans to publish, but I've gotten some ideas of, oh, this would be twisted and gnarly to introduce. But because you all are freaks, I've changed my mind. I'm just gonna write some child-friendly stuff like Care Bears. Nothing can be made twisted with that. Now, this is the pinnacle of my happiness in life. Just moved out. I'm an adult. I have my own place, living with my friends, illegally drinking beer, which was nasty, but I did it to look cool to my friends. Little trick I learned, if you can force down the first beer, sneak off to the sink and fill it with water, trust me, you'll thank me when morning comes because you will remember what happens. But, as any peak of happiness, that means a downward spiral is about to happen, which can be attributed to two things. First, I was single, which didn't seem that bad at the time, but a decade of that really does a number on you. But yeah, that was only 10% of the reason why I was losing happiness. The other 90%, Game of Thrones was about to take a real nosedive. Forgot this was a Game of Thrones video for a second, didn't ya? By the time I finished the books, I think it was 2016, and the next book had yet to come out, meaning it had been 5 years since the previous book. But hey, the first and most recent book took 5 years to make, so it's not that crazy that the newest one is also taking a similar amount of time to write. But it did mean that the 6th season of Game of Thrones wouldn't have a book to follow. Hell, my opinion of Season 5... God damn it, dog! My opinion of Season 5 had taken a strong nosedive, as it was already deviating from the source material greatly. It was no longer just the weakest season so far. I considered it to be simply bad, and boy, was I a green summer child unaware of what was to come. Season 6 came out, and this was the first time with the franchise that I was disappointed with what we got. Now, objectively speaking, Season 6 is better than Season 5, but when I watched Season 5, I was an uneducated, fresh 18-year-old man with no critical thinking skills at all, compared to how I was while Season 6 was airing. An uneducated, fresh 19-year-old man with no critical thinking skills who had not... I swear to God, Panda Man, stop! Why are you barking? Why are you barking so much? There's nothing out there. There's no cats. There's no homeless people. There's nobody there. A fresh 19-year-old man with no critical thinking skills who had now read the books, and it was very clear to me just how bad Season 5 and 6 were. I became more aware of the issues that the other 4 seasons had, but they were still very good. Even better in some regards, but 5 and 6? Shit. Pure shit. My mentality had changed. I knew from here on out that the next seasons would be garbage. My only hope was that eventually the next book would come out. Season 7 came out and it was bad, and still no Winds of Winter. People had already begun to lose faith that the book would come out during season 6, but I still had some faith. In fact, I took a deep snort of copium and believed that actually Winds of Winter was finished. It just wasn't finished before the 6th season, so they made plans to announce and release the book once the show was over. That way people wouldn't compare the books to the show as much, because currently that's what most people were objecting to. The show-only sheep were still lapping up that bullshit, though after the 7th season, more people began to realize that Game of Thrones would not be sticking the landing. And sure enough, season 8 came out, and it went down in history as one of the worst seasons of television ever. Now, is it actually the worst thing to ever exist? No, even back then, some shows were objectively worse. The issue came that Game of Thrones started so good that the final season stung extra hard. Don't misunderstand me though, even if you judge the final season on its own, it's still shit. It's not a 5 out of 10, while the first few seasons were 9s and 10s. No, it was still terrible. But hey, the show was over, and now George R.R. Martin would totally release the books. Hell, Ian McElhinney, the actor for Barristan Selmy, said that not only was Winds of Winter finished, but so was Dream of Springs. He just had a deal with the showrunners not to release them until the show concluded. Did that make any economic or creative sense? No, but it was what I wanted to hear. Then George R.R. Martin said the rumor was false, and it was at this point that I had given up hope on the series being finished. Maybe Winds of Winter will come out, but Dreams? Hell no. It had been almost a decade now, and I did some math. If there was a gap of 2 years between the first and second book, then another gap of 2 years, followed by a gap of 5 years, and then 6, it would seem fair to assume that the Winds would come out between 7 to 10 years, and the final book, A Dream of Springs, would take 14 to 20 years, which means best case scenario, the series would be finished by 2034 and George would be 86 years old. The average life expectancy is 75 years, and George isn't a particularly healthy man, but hey, it's not impossible. Then the best thing that could have happened did. 2020 COVID hit the scene. George talked about how he had a lot more time to write due to the lockdowns. It was happening with no more distractions with the show and being locked up. It could be done. He could release the book in 2021, which fits right with my 7 to 10 year range. And then Dream of Springs could still be possible. All it took was an act from God to make the Chinese fuck bats or whatever COVID was made with. George can do it. Maybe Dreams is actually the easiest book to write, so it takes less time. He releases it and finishes his magnum opus, and because of it being finished, his sales skyrocket. He rivals the likes of George R.R. and J.K. Rowling, earning his spot on the Mount Rushmore of fantasy. But that didn't happen. COVID was 6 years ago. Can you believe it? And still no wins, making the gap between his last book and now 15 years. And I think everyone, including George, has given up. Hell, I think George might have given up a lot sooner, but just didn't really share it. Simply telling everyone that it would be done, maybe to convince himself. In that time, we've had House of the Dragon and The Night of the Seven Kingdoms, with 5 other shows possibly being in development and movies to match. And for all the faults I have with them and will have with them, at least they will have an ending. This is the franchise now, not the 3-book series that George R.R. Martin has yet to finish. Who is going to want to read books that will never have an ending when the shows exist? If I had joined the fandom now instead of a decade ago, I'd probably think just like that. I wonder what the fandom will be like in another decade, or hell, even just 5 years. Personally, I see us going the way of Star Wars. Maybe we'll have 1 or 2 good products, but it'll be the sludge that rises to the surface. Hope I'm wrong though. Miracles happen sometimes. Maybe we will get those books. Maybe those future shows will not suck balls. Only time will tell. I hope this video ages poorly, but I've been kicking it with this franchise long enough that being pessimistic tends to be more accurate than being optimistic. To everyone watching though, stay safe, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.